I was only looking for last year's tax return. Nothing more than that. Instead, my hand landed on a folder I didn't recognize. Thick, official, tucked behind everything else. Inside were papers with my name typed at the top, and my signature at the bottom. A signature I never wrote. My name is Clement Boyce. I'm 74. Retired shipyard worker, Norfolk, Virginia. And that folder, sitting quiet in my own filing cabinet for months, was about to tell me something I never wanted to know about the boy I raised like my own son. I sat down at my kitchen table and spread the pages out in front of me, my hands going cold before I even fully understood what I was looking at. Closing documents. A reverse mortgage. On my house. The house I'd paid off free and clear almost 15 years ago. I read the first page 3 times, waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They didn't. According to the documents, I'd taken out a reverse mortgage 6 months earlier, borrowing against the full value of my home, with the funds disbursed in 3 separate payments to an account listed under my own name. I didn't have an account like that. I'd never signed anything like this in my life. I sat there a long moment, staring at a signature that looked almost like mine, close enough to fool a stranger, close enough to fool anyone who wasn't the man who'd actually written his own name for 70 years straight. It wasn't mine. I knew my own handwriting better than I knew my own face in a mirror. My mind went, almost immediately, to Curtis. I raised my nephew after my sister passed when he was 14, took him in without a second thought, put him through community college, helped him get his first apartment, never once asked for anything back beyond him doing right by himself. He'd been struggling the past year, something about a business venture that hadn't worked out the way he'd hoped, though he never gave me many details, and I never pushed. He'd started handling more of my paperwork about 8 months ago. Just to make things easier on you, Uncle Clem, he'd said. You've got enough going on without worrying about every little form. I'd trusted him completely. I called my old friend Otis that same evening, a man who'd spent 30 years working in title insurance before he retired, the kind of man who could spot a forged document from across a room. Clement, you sound rattled, he said. What's going on? I told him everything. The folder, the reverse mortgage, the signature that wasn't mine. Otis went quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that told me whatever he was thinking wasn't good. Clement, reverse mortgages require the homeowner to appear in person for closing, with identification, in front of a notary. If you never did that, somebody either impersonated you, or somebody forged the whole closing package start to finish. I asked him how something like that could even happen. More often than people think, he said, especially when somebody close to the homeowner has access to their personal documents already. Social security number, old utility bills, a copy of a driver's license. It's not as hard to fake as it should be. Otis offered to help me pull the full history on the loan the next morning. I barely slept that night, lying awake replaying the past 8 months, searching for anything Curtis had said or done that should have warned me sooner. There had been small things. A new car he'd shown up in 3 months back, nicer than anything he could have afforded on his own salary. A comment, offhand, about finally being able to breathe a little financially. A weekend trip he'd mentioned taking with friends, somewhere I knew he couldn't have paid for on what he made stocking shelves at the hardware store downtown. I hadn't thought much of any of it at the time. I thought about it plenty now. Otis called back the next afternoon, and I knew from the weight in his voice before he said a word that it wasn't good news. Clement, the loan closed 5 months ago. $140,000, disbursed in 3 payments. The funds went into an account that was opened the same week as the closing, under your name, but with a different mailing address listed. An address I didn't recognize at all. Whose address is it? I asked, though some part of me had already guessed the answer before he even said it. I ran it, Otis said quietly. It's Curtis's apartment. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something crack open in my chest that I didn't have words for yet. Otis connected me the next morning with an attorney he trusted, a sharp, careful woman named Denise Whitfield, who reviewed everything within the hour. Mr. Boyce, this is serious. Reverse mortgage fraud involving a forged closing package is a federal matter, since it involves federally regulated lending. But before we do anything, I need to understand exactly how this was pulled off, because closings like this normally require in-person verification. Someone would have needed to either impersonate you directly or find a notary willing to look the other way. That last part turned my stomach. Denise suggested I not confront Curtis directly yet, not until we understood the full scope of what had actually happened and who else might have been involved. It was one of the hardest things I've ever agreed to, sitting through an ordinary Sunday dinner with him 2 days later, listening to him talk about work, about his new apartment, while $140,000 of stolen equity sat documented in a file folder on Denise's desk. He seemed lighter than he had in months. I understood why now. Denise's investigator tracked down the notary listed on the closing documents within a few days, a woman named Patrice Odell, whose license, it turned out, had been suspended 8 months earlier for unrelated violations at a different closing, a suspension that hadn't yet been reflected in the state's public licensing database at the time the loan closed. She wasn't legally authorized to notarize anything by the time your loan went through, Denise told me, which means either she didn't check her own status, or she knew and did it anyway. Denise's investigator reached out to her directly, and within a day, Patrice agreed to speak, clearly frightened once she understood federal investigators were now involved. She admitted, through her own attorney, that Curtis had paid her a flat fee to notarize the closing package without requiring me to appear in person, using a driver's license photocopy and a signature Curtis provided himself, claiming I was recovering from a minor surgery and unable to travel to the closing. I'd never had any surgery. I'd never even been sick that whole year. Denise moved quickly once Patrice's statement came in, filing a formal fraud complaint with the lender and requesting the loan be voided entirely given the fraudulent notarization and forged signature. At the same time, she suggested one final step before everything became official through the courts. If Curtis believes nothing's wrong yet, she said, people sometimes say far more than they should. 2 nights later, Curtis came by the house to drop off some groceries, same as he did most weeks. Otis helped me set up a small recorder in an old radio on my kitchen counter, the same radio Curtis used to fiddle with as a boy, always trying to find better reception for the ballgame. After he set the groceries down, his phone rang, and thinking I'd stepped into the other room, he answered it right there in my kitchen. No, it's fine, he said. He hasn't said anything. I don't think he even opens that filing cabinet anymore. A pause. I know I owe you the rest of the fee. I'm working on it. Another pause. Once the next disbursement clears, I'll square everything up. He's not going to find out. He barely even checks his own mail these days. I stood in my own hallway, my hand pressed flat against the wall, listening to my nephew, the boy I'd raised, talk about the rest of my equity like it was simply the next installment of a plan already well underway. I don't think I've ever felt so cold standing in my own house. Denise had that recording, along with Patrice's statement and the full loan documentation, filed with federal investigators within the week. Given the clear pattern of fraud and the recorded admission, the case moved forward faster than either of us expected. What happened next wasn't the confrontation I'd braced myself for. Curtis showed up at my door on his own, for days later, before any formal charges had even been filed, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "Uncle Clem," he said, standing on my porch. "I need to tell you something before you hear it from somebody else." I let him in. He sat at my kitchen table, the same one he'd done his algebra homework at as a boy, and told me everything. The business venture had failed harder than he'd ever admitted to me, leaving him in debt to people far less patient than I ever could have been. He'd found Patrice through a mutual acquaintance, someone who'd mentioned she'd help with paperwork for the right price, and once the money started coming through, he told himself he'd pay it all back before I ever noticed anything was wrong. "That's not an excuse," he said, his voice breaking. "I know it's not. I just don't know how to explain it any better than that. It wasn't an excuse, but it was, finally, the truth." Given Curtis's full cooperation once confronted, along with his willingness to testify against Patrice regarding the fraudulent notarization, the federal case against him resulted in a plea agreement rather than a full trial. He received several years of probation, a structured restitution plan for the full $140,000, and a permanent restriction from ever holding financial power of attorney or similar authority over another person's affairs again. Patrice lost her notary commission permanently and faced her own separate federal charges for her role in falsifying the closing. The reverse mortgage itself was voided entirely once the fraud was confirmed, and my home, free and clear, was restored to exactly the way it had always been before that folder ever existed. It's been almost a year now. Curtis calls most weeks, Careful conversations that carry a different weight than they used to. Honest in a way we never quite managed before all this came out. He's working 2 jobs now, slowly chipping away at the restitution, and he's asked, more than once, if I'd be willing to let him earn back something closer to the trust we used to have. I told him that would take time. He said he understood, and for the first time in a long while, I believed he actually did. Last week, I opened that same filing cabinet again, looking for an entirely different document, something ordinary, a warranty card for a lawnmower I'd bought years back. I found it exactly where it should have been, nothing hidden behind it, nothing folded away where it didn't belong. I sat there a moment longer than I needed to, just holding that simple, unremarkable piece of paper, thinking about how strange it is that the greatest relief in the world sometimes isn't finding something at all. It's simply not finding anything you weren't supposed to find. If this story got to you, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe for more. I'll see you in the next one.